I still remember the exact sentence my mother used the night she closed the door on me. She said, "If you walk out to chase something this childish, don't come back expecting this house to still be yours." And she didn't raise her voice when she said it, which somehow made it land harder, quieter, final in a way that didn't leave space for negotiation, and I nodded because I had always been polite, always been the one who answered gently even when the room was already decided against me, and I said, "I understand, Mom," like I was agreeing to something small instead of watching my place in that house dissolve in real time, and my father stood a few feet behind her with his arms crossed, not angry, not loud, just certain, the kind of certainty that makes you feel like the conversation already happened without you, and he added, "You're making a mistake you won't recover from," not as a warning but as a conclusion. And I didn't argue, I never did, I just reached for the handle of my suitcase, the same one I had used for family trips, the same one my mother used to help me pack when I was younger, and for a second I thought about all those mornings she would remind me not to forget anything, not to leave anything behind, and now here I was, leaving everything behind without her saying a word to stop me, and I stepped outside onto the porch and the air felt different, colder maybe, or maybe it was just the absence of something I had always assumed would be there, and I turned back once, not dramatically, not expecting them to call me back, just out of habit, and the door was already closing, slowly, carefully, like even that moment needed to be handled with control, and then it clicked shut, and that sound stayed with me longer than anything else that night, longer than the silence that followed, longer than the weight of the suitcase in my hand, longer than the realization that I didn't actually have a plan, because I hadn't left to prove them wrong, I had left because staying would have meant agreeing with them, and I couldn't do that, not about this, not about the one thing that had ever made me feel like myself, baking, something they had always reduced to a hobby, something small, something they would smile at politely when I was younger and then quietly dismiss when I got older. "It's nice," my mother used to say, "but it's not a life," and I would nod because I understood what she meant, I just didn't agree. And disagreement in our house was something you learned to express softly or not at all, so I chose softly, always softly, even that night, even when everything in me felt louder than I had ever allowed it to be, and as I walked down the driveway I heard my father's voice one last time through the door, not shouting, just enough for it to carry, "Don't come back asking for help," and I paused for half a second, not to respond, just to let the sentence settle, because there are some sentences you don't answer, you just remember. And I remember thinking, very clearly, very calmly, "I won't," and then I kept walking, one step, then another, the wheels of the suitcase catching slightly on the concrete before finding rhythm, and I didn't look back again, not because I was strong, but because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't understood before, that sometimes the only way to keep your dignity is to leave quietly, without asking to be understood, without asking to be chosen, without asking for the door to stay open. And that night I left as their daughter who had made a childish decision, but I also left with something they couldn't see, something I didn't even fully understand yet, a kind of stillness, a decision that didn't need their approval to exist, and I carried it with me into the dark, into the unknown, into a life they had already decided would fail, and I didn't argue, I didn't cry out, I didn't try to change their minds, I just walked, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. I slept in a bus station that night because it was the only place still open and nobody asked questions, and I remember sitting on a hard plastic chair with my suitcase between my feet, watching the overhead lights flicker slightly every few minutes like the building itself was tired of staying awake, and I kept my hands folded in my lap the way I always did when I was trying to stay composed, because composure was something I had learned early, it made people more comfortable, it made things smoother, and even then, sitting there with nowhere to go, I did not want to look like someone who had just lost everything, I wanted to look like someone who had simply chosen a different path. And around 3 in the morning a man in a maintenance uniform walked past and glanced at me for a second longer than most people did, not suspicious, just curious, and he said, "You waiting for a ride?" And I smiled politely and said, something like that, and he nodded like that answer was enough, because sometimes people accept the version of your life you present to them if you say it calmly enough. And when the sun came up I went to the only place I could think of that felt familiar, a small bakery about 2 miles away that I used to pass on my way to school, and it opened at 6, and I stood outside for 10 minutes before the lights turned on inside, rehearsing what I was going to say, not because I needed the perfect words, but because I wanted to say them the right way, respectful, clear, not desperate, because desperation closes doors. And when the owner unlocked the front door, I stepped forward and said, "Good morning, my name is Tige Monroe. I was wondering if you might need any help, even just cleaning or prep work." And she looked at me for a moment, taking in the suitcase, the way I was dressed, the fact that I was there before opening, and she said, "Do you have experience?" And I answered honestly, "Not professionally, but I learn quickly, and I will not waste your time." And she held the door open a little wider and said, "Come inside, we will talk." And that was the first door that opened after the one that closed, and it did not come with promises, it did not come with comfort, it came with a sink full of dishes, a floor that needed to be swept, and a list of tasks that nobody else wanted to do, and I said yes to. All of it, quietly, consistently, without trying to prove anything beyond the next small thing in front of me, and for the first few weeks. I did not touch the ovens, I did not decorate anything, I washed, I carried, I measured ingredients under supervision, and I listened, always listening, because there is a difference between wanting something and understanding it, and I needed to understand it completely. And the owner, her name was Mrs. Calder, noticed things without announcing that she noticed them, the way I stayed late without being asked, the way I rewrote recipes in my notebook after my shift, the way I corrected my own mistakes before anyone pointed them out. And one afternoon she placed a tray in front of me and said, "Show me how you would finish these." And it was a simple pastry, nothing elaborate, but my hands were steady, and I worked carefully, not rushing, not showing off, just doing it the way I believed it should be done. And when I finished, she looked at the tray for a long moment and then said, "You have good instincts," and I nodded and said, "Thank you," like it was a normal comment, even though it felt like something much larger. And that night when I left the bakery, I checked my phone out of habit, even though I knew there would be no messages, no missed calls, nothing from home, and there was nothing, exactly as expected, and I stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, not waiting, just acknowledging the silence. And then I put the phone back in my pocket and walked to the small room I had rented above a laundromat with the first paycheck I received, a narrow space with a single window and a mattress on the floor, and it was not comfortable. It was not impressive, but it was mine, and as I sat there that night, going over measurements in my notebook, I remembered my father's voice, steady and certain, "You will not recover from this." And I did not argue with that sentence even then, I just let it sit in my mind the way I had let it sit on the driveway, and I thought, very quietly, recovery is not always about going back, sometimes it is about building something new in a place no one thought to look. And I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and prepared to do it all again the next day, without announcement, without expectation, just one step at a time. I did not plan to leave Mrs. Calder's bakery when I first walked in with a suitcase and no direction, but growth has a way of quietly asking you to move before you feel ready, and it started with a single phone call 2 weeks after that hotel event. The same event manager reached out again, this time not for a one-night request but for a standing arrangement, and he said, "We are updating our dessert program, and I would like consistency, not just quality. Can you handle that?" And I paused for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood what he was really asking, not about skill, but about scale, and I replied, "Yes, with the right structure in place." And he said, "Then build it." And that was the first time someone spoke to me as if I already had the authority to expand, not as someone learning, but as someone expected to deliver. And when I told Mrs. Calder about it that evening, she listened without interrupting, then wiped her hands on a towel and said, "You are leaving," not as a question, and I answered, "I would like to try," and she nodded once and said, "Then do it properly," and that was the closest thing to approval she ever gave. And the next few weeks moved quickly but quietly. I found a small commercial kitchen space on the edge of town, nothing impressive, just enough room for 2 ovens, a prep table, and storage. And I signed the lease with hands that were steady because I had already made harder decisions with less certainty. And I hired one assistant, a young man named Daniel who asked more questions than anyone I had worked with before, and I appreciated that because questions meant attention, and attention meant fewer mistakes. And I told him on his first day, "We will not rush anything we cannot fix," and he nodded seriously, as if that sentence mattered, and it did, because from the beginning I built everything around control, not speed, not volume, just consistency, and the first month was quiet, just Fulfilling the hotel order, waking up before dawn, measuring, baking, packaging, delivering, repeating, no announcements, no marketing, just work, and then something shifted, the hotel began recommending my desserts to private clients, small events at first, then larger ones, and each time I introduced myself the same way, my name is Tige Monroe, it is a pleasure to work with you, never adding more than necessary, never correcting assumptions about who I was or where I came from, and people began to remember the name, not because I pushed it, but because the work carried it forward. And one afternoon a woman approached me after a tasting and said, "You should have your own storefront, this is too good to stay behind the scenes," and I smiled politely and replied, "I appreciate that," because appreciation was safe, it did not commit me to anything, but that sentence stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it was flattering, but because it reflected something I had been avoiding, visibility, and visibility meant being seen, and being seen meant the possibility of being recognized by people I had not heard from in years, and for a long time I chose not to think about that. I focused on the work, on refining processes, on building something stable enough that it would not collapse under attention, and eventually the decision was no longer optional. Demand outgrew the kitchen, orders stacked beyond what two people could manage, and I stood in that small space one evening looking at the schedule, the equipment, the limitations, and I understood that staying hidden was no longer the careful choice, it was the limiting one, and the next week I signed another lease, this time for a small storefront on a quiet street, nothing extravagant, but visible, intentional, mine, and on the day we opened, there was no grand announcement, no line outside the door, just a few customers who walked in out of curiosity, and I greeted each of them the same way, calm, respectful, attentive, and when they left, some of them smiled in a way that felt familiar. The same reason I started this in the first place, and that night after closing, I stood behind the counter and looked at the name on the window, Monroe, simple, clear, undeniable, and for a moment I allowed myself to acknowledge the distance between that girl standing on the porch with a suitcase and a person standing here now, not with pride, not with regret, just with understanding, and then I turned off the lights, locked the door, and prepared for the next day, because whatever this had become, it was still built the same way, quietly, carefully, one decision at a time. The first time someone recognized my name without me introducing myself, I did not react the way people expect you to, I did not pause dramatically or ask how they knew it, I simply nodded and said, "It is a pleasure to meet you," because recognition, like everything else, needed to be handled with care, and it happened on a Thursday afternoon when the shop was steady but not crowded, the kind of day where conversations were quiet and orders moved without urgency, and a woman in a tailored coat stepped up to the counter, looked at the display, then looked at me, and said, "You are Monroe," not asking, just confirming, and I replied, "Yes, ma'am," and she smiled slightly and said, "I have been looking for you," and there was something in the way she said it that told me this was not casual, this was intentional, and she introduced herself as a consultant for a hospitality group, the kind that does not advertise publicly but operates in spaces where details matter, and she said, "We are redesigning dessert programs across several properties, and your work has come up more than once," and I listened without interrupting, the way I always did, because people reveal more when they are not rushed, and she continued, "We are not looking for volume, we are looking for identity," and I answered, "Identity requires consistency," and she nodded as if that was the response she expected, and then she said, "Would you be open to a conversation about partnership?" And I did not say yes immediately, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that the right answer is not always the fastest one, and I said, "I would be open to understanding the structure first," and she smiled again, a little wider this time, and said, "Good, then we should talk," and we scheduled a meeting for the following week, and when she left, Daniel looked at me from behind the prep table and said, "That seemed important," and I replied, "It is an opportunity," and he asked, "Is that different?" and I said, "Yes, because opportunity requires decision, and decision changes direction," and over the next few days I prepared the same way I always did, not with presentations or rehearsed pitches, but with clarity. I reviewed numbers, capacity, supply chains, margins, everything that would matter once conversation turned into expectation, and when the meeting came it was held in a quiet conference room at one of their properties, understated but precise, and I arrived 10 minutes early, sat down, and waited without checking my phone, without filling the silence, because presence matters in rooms like that. And when they entered, 3 of them, all composed, all observant, the woman from the shop introduced me simply, "This is Tige Monroe," and nothing more was needed, and the conversation moved quickly, not small talk, not compliments, just questions. Can you scale without losing quality? What systems are in place? How do you handle failure points? And I answered each one the same way I handled everything else, directly, calmly, without exaggeration. And at one point one of them said, "You seem very certain," and I replied, "I am careful," and that distinction seemed to matter. And by the end of the meeting they presented a proposal: multi-location integration, brand association, expansion beyond a single storefront. And I looked at the document for a moment before responding, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was measuring, and I said, "This will require adjustments on both sides." And one of them leaned forward slightly and said, "Such as?" And I answered, "Control over process, not just outcome." And there was a brief pause, the kind that tests whether you will soften your position, and I did not. And then the woman who first approached me said, "That is reasonable." And the conversation shifted from evaluation to alignment, and when I left that building that afternoon I understood something had changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but structurally, the kind of change that moves quietly at first and then becomes impossible to ignore. And over the next few months, everything expanded, not chaotically, but deliberately: additional staff, refined systems, new locations under my oversight, and the name Monroe began appearing in places I had never planned for, menus in cities I had not lived in, events I had not attended, and through all of it I maintained the same approach, the same tone, the same standard, because growth without control is just noise. And one evening after closing I stood in the shop, now larger, busier, more visible than anything I had imagined, in that small room above the laundromat, and Daniel said, "Do you ever think about how far this has gone?" And I looked at the counter, the ovens, the quiet after a full day, and replied, "I think about how it continues." And he nodded as if that answer made sense, and as I turned off the lights I remembered a sentence from years ago: "Do not come back asking for help." And I realized something subtle but important. I had not gone back, I had not asked, and I had built something that no longer needed to return to be complete, and that understanding settled in quietly, the way most important things do, without announcement, without noise, just certainty. Success does not announce itself when it arrives, it simply changes the way people speak to you, and I noticed that shift one morning when I walked into a new location we had just integrated, not as a guest, not as staff, but as the person responsible for everything that would happen inside that kitchen. And the manager greeted me with a tone that carried expectation instead of curiosity. "We have been waiting for you," he said, and I nodded and replied, "Thank you for your patience," because patience was something I had learned to value, both in others and in myself, and as I stepped inside I could feel it immediately, the difference between a place that functions and a place that performs. The details were correct, the equipment was clean, the staff was trained, but something was missing, something subtle, and I did not point it out right away. I observed, I watched how ingredients were handled, how timing was managed, how communication moved between people, and after about 20 minutes I turned to the manager and said, "May I see the preparation schedule?" And he handed it to me without hesitation, and as I reviewed it I noticed the pattern: efficient on paper, inconsistent in execution, and I said, "This will produce variation, not as criticism, just as fact." And he asked, "How would you adjust it?" And I replied, "We remove the variables we do not control." And that was how the day began, not with correction, but with recalibration, and over the next few hours I worked alongside them, not above them, adjusting sequences, refining measurements, demonstrating small changes that created noticeable differences. And I spoke the same way I always did, calm, precise, respectful. "Try it this way, let us measure again, we can improve this." And slowly the room shifted, tension replaced with focus, uncertainty replaced with clarity, and by the end of the day the output matched the standard I expected, not perfectly, but consistently enough to build on. And as I prepared to leave, the manager said, "You did not raise your voice once," and I answered, "There was no need," and he smiled slightly and said, "People usually do," and I replied, "People usually react, because reaction is easy, control is deliberate." And that distinction followed me as expansion continued, more locations, more teams, more variables to manage, and with each new step the structure I had built was tested, not dramatically, but constantly, and there were moments when things did not align, deliveries delayed, staff miscommunicating, systems pushed beyond their limits, and each time I responded the same way, not with urgency, but with attention, addressing the root instead of the surface, because I understood something that had not been obvious in the beginning. Scale does not create problems, it reveals them, and if you are not prepared to see them clearly, they will repeat. And one evening after reviewing reports from 3 different locations I noticed a pattern in one of them, small inconsistencies in output that did not match the others, not large enough to trigger complaints, but enough to matter, and I scheduled a visit without announcement, arriving early, observing quietly, and within an hour I identified the issue, not a person, not a mistake, but a habit, a small shortcut that had become routine, and I gathered the team and said, "We are not correcting an error, we are resetting a standard," and they listened, not because I demanded it, but because I spoke with certainty grounded in detail, and we adjusted the process together, step by step, until the habit was replaced with intention. And as I left that location one of the staff members approached me and said, "I thought you would be stricter," and I replied, "I am consistent," and he nodded slowly, as if that explained something he had not expected. And later that night, back at the main shop, Daniel asked me, "Do you ever feel like this could fall apart?" And I considered the question for a moment before answering, "Only if we stop paying attention," and he said, "And if something unexpected happens?" And I looked at the schedule on the wall, the names, the structure, the system we had built, and said, "Then we respond the same way we built this, carefully," and as I turned off the lights I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel before, not relief, not pride, but stability, the kind that does not depend on one moment or one decision, but on a pattern that has been proven over time. And for the first time since I walked away from that house with a suitcase, I was not thinking about what might happen next. I was thinking about how prepared I was for it, and that difference changed everything. It happened on a morning that did not feel different until it was, the kind of morning where everything was already in motion before I stepped through the door, orders scheduled, staff in position, ovens preheating, and I moved through the space the same way I always did, quietly, observant, adjusting small details without interrupting the rhythm. And Daniel handed me the daily report without saying anything because he knew I preferred to review before asking questions, and I nodded as I scanned the numbers, consistent, steady, exactly where they should be, and then the front door opened, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the air in a way that made one of the newer staff glance up longer than usual, and I did not turn immediately, not because I ignored it, but because I had learned to finish one thing before moving to the next. And when I did look up I saw her standing just inside the doorway, my mother, holding her bag with both hands like she was not sure where to place it, and for a moment neither of us moved, not because we were frozen, but because there was too much history in that space to rush past, and she looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence. The certainty that used to define her was not there, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, and I stepped forward the same way I would for any guest and said, "Good morning. How may I help you?" Not because I did not recognize her, but because I understood that recognition is not always the first step, and she hesitated before answering, her eyes moving briefly across the room, the display, the staff, the name on the wall, and then back to me, and she said, "Tige," softly, like testing whether she was allowed to use it, and I nodded once and replied, "Yes, Mom," calm, respectful, clear. And there was a pause, longer than necessary for a simple exchange, and one of the staff members shifted slightly behind the counter, aware that something was happening but not yet understanding what, and my mother adjusted her grip on her bag and said, "I was not sure if you would be here." And I answered, "I am here most mornings," and that seemed to settle something for her, not fully, but enough to continue. And she took a small step forward and said, "You have done well," the words careful, measured, like she had rehearsed them, and I replied, "Thank you," because acknowledgement does not require elaboration, and another pause followed, and I could see the question forming before she asked it, not in her words, but in the way she held herself, the hesitation, the calculation, the unfamiliar uncertainty, and finally she said, "Could we talk?" And I glanced briefly at Daniel, who gave a small nod, already understanding without needing instruction, and I gestured toward a table near the window and said, of course, and we walked over together, not side by side, but not distant either, a measured space between us that neither of us adjusted, and as we sat down I placed 2 cups on the table, tea, the same way I always served it, steady, without flourish, and she looked at the cup for a moment before speaking, and when she did her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I did not come to interrupt your work, and I answered, you are not interrupting, because technically she was not. The work continued, the system held, everything I had built did not depend on a single moment anymore, and that seemed to matter, because she nodded slightly and then said, your father, things have not been going well, and she stopped there, not because she was finished, but because she was choosing how to continue, and I did not fill the silence, I let it remain, because silence invites truth more effectively than questions, and after a few seconds she added, we have made some decisions that did not work out, careful, indirect, avoiding specifics, and I looked at her steadily and said, what kind of decisions? Not challenging, just precise, and she met my gaze for a moment before looking down at her hands and answering, financial ones, and there it was, not everything, but enough to understand the direction, and I nodded once, not surprised, not reactive, just acknowledging the information, and she continued, we thought we could manage it, but it has become more complicated, and her voice shifted slightly on that last word, more honest, less controlled, and then she said the sentence I had heard years ago in a different form, but now it carried a different weight, we need help, and the room did not change, the sounds of the kitchen continued, orders were called, doors opened and closed, but something in the space between us shifted completely, and I sat there for a moment, not responding immediately, because some sentences deserve to be considered before they are answered, and I looked at her, not as the person who had closed the door on me, not as the authority she once held, but as someone sitting across from me asking for something she had once denied, and I said, very calmly, very clearly, what exactly do you need help with? And she exhaled slightly, as if that question allowed her to finally say what she came to say, and as she began to explain, I listened the same way I always had, quietly, attentively, because understanding comes before decision, and I knew that whatever she said next would not just be about money, it would be about something much deeper, something that had been building for years, and now, finally, had reached my door. She did not rush once she started explaining, which told me more than the words themselves, because when people are desperate they tend to speak quickly, they fill the space with details, but she chose her sentences carefully, almost the same way she used to when she wanted to control how something was received, only this time the control was not complete, there were pauses where certainty used to be, and she said, your father invested in a development project about 3 years ago, and I nodded slightly, not reacting, just following, and she continued, it was presented as stable, long-term, something that would secure things for the future, and I asked, was it diversified, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, no, and that was the first clear point, not a mistake, a decision, and she added, at the time it seemed reasonable, and I said, at the time, not correcting, just marking the shift, and she looked at me and said, we trusted the people involved, and I replied, trust is not a structure, and she did not argue with that, she simply lowered her gaze slightly and continued, the project has not performed as expected, and I asked, define not performed, and she exhaled softly and said, it has lost value, significantly, and I nodded once, the way I would in any meeting where information was being clarified, because this was no different, not emotionally. Not structurally, it was a situation that required understanding before response, and she went on, we attempted to recover by reallocating funds, and I said, from where, and she answered, savings, retirement accounts, lines of credit, and each word added another layer, not dramatic, but cumulative, and I asked, were those decisions coordinated, and she shook her head slightly and said, your father handled most of it, and there it was again, not blame, but placement, and I remained still, listening, because interruption would only slow the process, and she continued, we thought it would stabilize, but it did not, and I said, and now, and she looked at me directly for the first time since we sat down and said, now we are at a point where we cannot manage it alone, and the honesty in that sentence was different from the rest, less controlled, more immediate, and I let that sit for a moment before asking, what specifically are you asking from me? because clarity matters, especially when the stakes are not just financial. And she adjusted her posture slightly and said, we need guidance, restructuring, possibly assistance to stabilize the situation. And I nodded slowly, processing, not reacting, and I asked, have you spoken to any financial advisors? And she said, we have, but the recommendations are complex, and we do not fully understand the implications. And I said, then the issue is not just the numbers, it is the comprehension. And she nodded, relieved that I had articulated it clearly. And then she added, more quietly, we thought you might be able to help us navigate it. And there was a subtle shift in the way she said you, not as the daughter she once dismissed, but as someone whose capability she could no longer ignore. And I recognized that shift, not with satisfaction, but with awareness, because it was not the moment that mattered, it was what it represented. And I asked one more question, what is the current exposure? And she gave me a number, not exaggerated, not softened, just stated. And it was substantial, enough to explain the tension in her voice, enough to explain why she was here instead of anywhere else. And I did not react outwardly, I simply nodded and said, I understand. And she looked at me carefully, searching for something, perhaps judgment, perhaps reassurance, and I offered neither, only presence, because those are the only things that hold in moments like this. And then she said something that shifted the conversation in a way numbers could not. We should have listened differently, not an apology, not fully, but closer than anything she had said before. And I let that sentence settle without responding to it directly, because some acknowledgements are not meant to be answered, they are meant to be noted. And I placed my hands lightly on the table and said, if I am involved, it will be structured. And she nodded immediately, of course, and I continued, that means transparency, documentation, and adherence to the plan. And she said, we understand. And I added, it also means that I will make decisions based on what is sustainable, not what is comfortable. And there was a brief pause before she said, we are not looking for comfort. And that was the first time her voice held something familiar, not authority, but resolve. And I nodded once and said, then we can proceed with a review. And as I said it, I was aware of the full circle of that moment, not in a dramatic way, not as a reversal to be announced, but as a quiet alignment of roles that had changed without needing to be declared. And she sat back slightly, as if a weight had shifted, not removed, but shared. And I picked up my cup of tea, took a small sip, and said, I will need all relevant documents. And she said, I brought what I could, placing her bag on the table. And as she opened it, carefully, deliberately, I realized that the conversation had moved beyond the past, beyond what had been said or not said years ago, into something immediate, something that would require the same approach I had used to build everything else, careful, precise, consistent. And as I looked at the first set of papers she handed me, I understood that this was not the moment of resolution, it was the beginning of something far more complex, and far more revealing. The documents were not complicated in the way people expect complicated things to be, they were clear enough if you knew where to look, numbers aligned in ways that told a story without needing explanation. And as I turned each page I could see the pattern forming, not a single mistake, but a series of decisions made under the assumption that recovery would always be possible, that there would always be another adjustment, another opportunity to correct direction. And I placed the papers down carefully and said, this is not a short-term issue. And my mother nodded, not surprised, just confirming what she already knew. And I continued, it can be stabilized, but not without changes. And she said, we expected that. And I looked at her for a moment before adding, the changes will not be comfortable. And she held my gaze and replied, we understand. And for the first time, there was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to soften the reality of what needed to happen. And I outlined the initial steps, restructuring liabilities, consolidating accounts, eliminating non-essential expenditures, a process that would take time and discipline, not quick solutions, not temporary relief. And she listened the same way I had listened to her, quietly, attentively, because understanding is reciprocal when it is genuine. And when I finished she asked, will it work? And I answered honestly, if it is followed exactly. And she nodded slowly, as if accepting not just the plan, but the condition attached to it. And there was a moment after that where neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been placed on the table. And then she said, more softly than before, you have become someone we did not expect. And I considered that for a moment before replying, I became someone I needed to be. and she lowered her eyes slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition, and I added, this is not about proving anything, and she said, I know, and I believed her, not because of the words, but because of the way she said them, without defense, without explanation, just acceptance. And as we gathered the documents I outlined the next steps, timelines, communication, expectations, all structured, all clear. Because clarity is what holds when everything else feels uncertain, and when we stood up from the table she hesitated for a brief second before saying, thank you, and I nodded and replied, you are welcome, not as a formality, but as a simple acknowledgement of the moment, and she looked around the shop one more time, taking in the space, the movement, the quiet precision of everything happening without interruption, and then she said, your father would not have believed this, and I answered, he did not need to, and there was no edge in my voice, no correction, just a statement, and she nodded again, understanding more than the words themselves, and as she walked toward the door I followed at a respectful distance, not guiding, not holding, just present, and when she reached the entrance she paused and turned back slightly, not fully, just enough to say, we will send everything you asked for, and I said, I will review it as soon as it arrives, and she gave a small nod before stepping outside, and the door closed behind her the same way it closed for every customer, steady, controlled, without emphasis, and I stood there for a moment after she left, not reflecting, not revisiting the past, just acknowledging the present, and then Daniel approached quietly and asked, is everything all right? And I looked at the counter, the orders, the system continuing exactly as it should, and I replied, everything is clear, and he nodded, accepting that answer without needing more, and I returned to the work, adjusting a tray, checking a detail, moving forward the same way I always had, because nothing about this moment required me to stop, nothing about it required me to change direction, it simply required me to apply the same care, the same structure, the same discipline to something that had finally come to me instead of the other way around, and later that evening, after the shop had closed and the lights were turned off, I stood for a moment in the quiet and remembered the sentence that had once defined the end of something, do not come back asking for help, and I realized that no one had come back to the same place, not them, not me. The distance between those two moments was not just time, it was everything built in between. And as I turned the key in the lock and stepped outside, I understood something with complete certainty. I did not leave that house to be proven right, I left because it was the only way to become someone who could stand here now, not above, not below, but exactly where I chose to be, and that was more than enough.